Hello everyone. So I have some very exciting news, and that is that I just had some custom bookshelves installed in my rec room in my basement. This is something that I have been wanting to do for a really long time. I have had tons of boxes of books in storage for as long as I can remember, as I've been moving from place to place throughout university and medical school and residency, and finally, I can take all of my books out of boxes. So I have had this set up behind me, which are my fantasy books. I have a couple of bookshelves across the room that are kind of RPG fantasy books, science fiction, and some comics and manga. But other than that, which is in our kind of joint computer and games room, I didn't have anywhere else to store all of my other books. So those are my kids' books, my kind of teen books that I'm saving for my kids to read, and then all of the genres that I have that are not science fiction or fantasy or comics. So I finally had the bookshelves put in, and they are beautiful. And as I was organizing them, I'm sure I will reorganize them a million times, but as I was organizing them for the first time and I was putting my nonfiction up on the shelf, I thought that it might be fun to do a video about nonfiction that could appeal to fans of fantasy. I know that people who read a lot of fantasy are sometimes looking to branch out to other genres, and I think that nonfiction is a really rewarding genre to read. I think there's a lot to be learned. And I think that the 5 books that I'm going to talk about today are probably appealing for lots of people who read fantasy. I have 3 of the books on hand. One of them I have loaned out and I don't know to whom, so I don't have my copy, and the other one I read through the library. So I'll start with the 3 books that I found just as I was perusing my own shelves. The first one, this one actually comes from the shelf behind me, but this is Mythos by Stephen Fry. So I don't really know if you would call this nonfiction because, you know, the stories within are fictional, but I think that mythology and the mythologies of various cultures are really appealing to fantasy readers. Greek mythology is obviously a very common and popular one to get into. Norse mythology also holds a lot of appeal, but I think it would also be interesting to read more broadly in a wider variety of cultures. And so that is one of the reading goals that I have for myself, is to kind of seek out those other mythologies, find some good books and read them. So if you have any recommendations for books about mythology that are not Norse or Greek based, then I would love to hear them. But the reason that I picked this book, this is a really accessible place to start for Greek mythology. So this is a trilogy actually of books that Stephen Fry has put out. This one being Mythos, one being Heroes, which I also have down on the shelf. And there's another one which I believe is called Troy, that is centered around the heroes from the Trojan War. But Stephen Fry, and I listened to this one actually by audio, and he is a fantastic narrator. He has taken the essence of these stories, kind of condensed them down to some of the main selling points. And the way that he writes is like the way that he talks and the way that he entertains. It's very easy to get into, it's very clever, very witty, and I thought that for someone who's looking for a gentle introduction into the Greek myths, or who is looking to get into something that feels a little bit fresh, then Mythos is definitely a great place to start. Another area that I feel like holds a lot of appeal for fans of fantasy is the animal companion trope. So a lot of people love a fantasy story with a good animal companion, and at least for myself, that love of animal companions stems from a love of and an interest in animals. So I have read a lot of nonfiction about animals. I have a daughter who is obsessed with animals and animal facts. And so I have read so many glossaries, encyclopedias, so many works of nonfiction geared both towards children and adults because she wants to read it all. But one book that taught me a lot of things that I had not previously known is this one, which is called The Truth About Animals by Lucy Cook. So Lucy is a zoologist, and her main area of interest is sloths, actually. So that they are her favorite animal. She spent a lot of time working with sloths. but over the course of her career, she has gone across the globe, has worked with other scientists in the field, and has examined a wide variety of animals. This book, The Truth About Animals, is a book that seeks to break down some of our stereotypes about animals. So we as a species tend to attribute human characteristics to wild animals. And I think that is because we appreciate animals and we want to be close to them. But what Cook does in this book is she breaks down those animal stereotypes and shows us how the way that we, or the values that we place on animals, are really far from their actual nature. And there are a lot of cool facts in here. It's broken up by species, so she talks about eels, beavers, hyenas. There's a ton here, and kind of takes our common misconceptions about these animals and shows us what they're actually like in the wild. I had hoped to read this one with my daughter, but there's actually a lot of focus put on the reproductive habits of animals, which gets a little bit graphic. So I didn't know if it was quite appropriate for a 6-year-old, but super, super interesting. I think if you love animal companions, if you enjoy learning about animals and you feel like you already have a lot of ground knowledge, this has some pretty cool information that I had never heard of before. Kind of piggybacking off of the animal idea, another work of nonfiction that I read, I believe it was 2 years ago, but it may have been last year. It's hard to keep it all straight with everything that's been going on. But that is The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. So this is a relatively new release. I read it as soon as it came out, and it is written by a young paleontologist, kind of an up-and-coming young man in the field who kind of lived all of our 5-year-old dreams. So he, as I'm sure many of us who are fantasy fans, grew up obsessed with dinosaurs. Except his obsession didn't peter off. He didn't go off to study other things. He actually went to school, studied, and became a paleontologist. And the book gives you a good overview of the various geological ages, and it gives you a breakdown of the types of dinosaurs that lived in each age, but also tells us a little bit about how we understand the evolution of the dinosaur, why certain dinosaurs lived at certain times, and also talks a bit about modern paleontology and the way that science has evolved and the way that we can now study dinosaurs and the types of, I guess, the branches of biology that we use to make inferences about dinosaurs, and how this is still a really active and exciting field. It just looks a little bit different than it did 20 or 30 years ago. This was fascinating. Again, I feel like I had a pretty good ground level knowledge of dinosaurs, as anyone who was once a dinosaur aficionado would have, but this filled in a lot of gaps for me, and it was just interesting. It was easy to read. He doesn't get bogged down in a lot of technical language, and it was nice to go back and revisit that love of dinosaurs. It made me feel a little bit like the kid who used to be obsessed so many years ago. So again, this is one that I would definitely recommend, and I think could be really appealing for fans of fantasy. The next one that I want to talk about is one that I picked up from the library, and that is Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So as fans of fantasy, or probably more specifically science fiction, I think we all feel that pull and that appeal of the broader universe, the mysteries of space. And for people like me who don't have a very good grasp on some common terms, some common theories of astrophysics, Neil deGrasse Tyson's book was an excellent introduction. It is very, very short. It is easily digestible. And again, he is able to break down these really complex ideas and terms and make them palatable and fascinating for an everyday audience. My husband studied a little bit he studied physics and did a little bit of kind of astrophysics in university. So his working knowledge of all this stuff is much higher than mine. And he tends to be the person that I go to ask questions when either like if I'm reading a hard sci-fi and there's something that I don't really grasp, or if I just want to talk about something. But I think Neil deGrasse Tyson's book did a fantastic job of opening up that world to someone who has a basic interest. I think if you already know a lot about the topic, or you like to be well read in that area, you may not learn a whole lot that is new from this, but it's still, again, like very tiny, very digestible, and well worth your time. It definitely made me want to read more nonfiction focused around astrophysics and space. And my husband has a bunch of those books actually that I just unpacked and put on the new shelves. So I'm going to pick up a couple of those moving forward, and maybe I will have some more books to recommend sometime soon. The fifth and final book that I would like to recommend for lovers of fantasy is one that I do own, but unfortunately I loaned it out to someone and I don't remember who or how to get it back, so I'm probably just going to have to rebuy it. And that is Stephen King's On Writing. So this is the only memoir type book that I have put on this list. But whether or not you like Stephen King, I think it will be hard to find someone who is not impressed by the fact that he so consistently puts out work that is so readable, so engaging, and is able to please a large portion of his fan base. As with anybody who has published, all of those books, there's going to be some misses, there's going to be some that rise above the others, but what he has been able to do to be such a consistent and prolific author, it makes people interested. And I love his books anyway, so I have always been interested in his life, how he decided to become a writer, what influenced him. But I think even if you are just interested in writing yourself, if you're interested in the process of producing fantasy, of knowing what inspires people to write, what their influences have been, then I think On Writing is a good place to start. It is kind of a practical combination of stories from Stephen King's early life, stories about the process of writing Carrie and writing some of his other early books. He includes lists of books that have been influential to him, talks about some of the different types of media that has been able to influence him, and he does it all with this very down-to-earth, self-deprecating style. It's been a while since I read this, but there is a quote that stands out where effectively he compares himself to a Big Mac and fries. He says, I am not going to be the next Faulkner, I am not the next Hemingway, but I am something that can be enjoyed by many people, and I'm okay with that. I personally think he sells himself a little bit short. There are aspects of his writing, even technically, that I think are amongst the best writers of our time. Now, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and argue that what he writes is literary fiction, but that doesn't, to me, not being literary fiction doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. I think that Stephen King is a writer that aspiring writers can learn a lot from. I think that he has a style and he is approachable in a way that makes this book easily digestible for people of all kind of stages and aspirations. And I think this is just a highly enjoyable read. He's got a great style. His books are easy to get through, and On Writing is fantastic. So those are the 5 pieces of nonfiction that I have read that I feel would appeal specifically to fantasy and science fiction lovers. There are a couple that I have recently put on my list to read that I also think could fit this category and that I'm looking forward to reading. And I have one of them right here. So this is H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald, which was a huge hit when it was released a few years ago. And basically this is a memoir that examines Helen Macdonald's grief about losing her dad, about her training a hawk, and about her reading about T.H. White, who wrote The Once and Future King, his memoir about training his hawk. And I think all of these threads kind of interweave together to produce a story that has been highly critically acclaimed and that I am really looking forward to reading. So this one may have some appeal for fantasy fans as well. And the other one that I would like to get to is Wizardry and Wild Romance by Michael Moorcock. So I have been I always try to fill in my to be read pile. I try to think about kind of the backlisted fantasy that I would really like to get to. And Michael Moorcock is an author that I have never read, but while I was looking back at this backlisted fantasy, I found the name of an essay that he had written called Epic Pooh, which is based on Winnie the Pooh and is spelled like Winnie the Pooh, but I think is also meant to be a bit of play on words because it's his deconstruction of fantasy as a genre and his opinions on popular writers such as Tolkien and others who he feels have been writing this derivative romantic style of fantasy. And he has very strong opinions about what constitutes good fantasy and not so good fantasy, despite his respect for these other authors. So I do love a good divisive opinion, and I do like reading essays, and I like reading people's opinions who differ from my own. So ever since I saw the name of that essay and found out that he has some very strong opinions about some of the authors that I really love, I have wanted to read some of Moorcock's, both his fiction and his nonfiction. So I'm hoping to pick up a copy of that somewhere and be able to give that a read and let you know what I think. But that is the end. This was a quick video, just some recommendations if you're looking to get into some nonfiction, if you want to try something outside your usual wheelhouse. I highly recommend all of the books that I have talked about today. And if you have any suggestions for your favorite nonfiction, then feel free to leave them below. Have a great day. Bye.